Hello, this is Kevin. Welcome back to the Messy City podcast. Have a very special guest here today, somebody that I've admired for a long time, and I'm absolutely delighted to have him here. David Sucher with us from Seattle, Washington. Welcome, David.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Well, it's a great pleasure of mine. You probably don't know this, but back in the day, so David became probably more well known for his fantastic book called City Comforts, which is almost 30 years old. But you probably don't know that for a number of years I used to teach in an urban design program, and I always had one of your books was required reading for the students. I always felt like it was one of the seminal books to really explain the art of making cities well and urban design, and so I'm really excited to talk with you about it and talk about what you've been up to in recent years.
Thank you very much. It's very flattering. I really appreciate that, honestly. I do.
It's well, let's talk a little bit about City Comforts.
Sure.
It has been almost 30 years, which probably is hard to believe.
It's
Uh,
amazing.
and when you let's talk about when you initially thought about writing that book. Like what drove you to put that together and put that out in the world? Because this was 1995, I believe.
Yeah, it was, the book, of course, took 2 or 3 years. I think the genesis was I was on a advisory committee. I mean, it was is really pretty simple. I was on a citizens advisory committee. Come to think of it, I was actually ex officio, I think is the term. I was on the city planning commission, and we had a citizens advisory committee to establish design review for the basically the multifamily neighborhoods in the city, the neighborhood commercial. And I've noticed something very interesting that in the beginning of the meetings or at the end or sort of in the just kind of chat, there was no discussion of actual buildings or situations or environments. People, you'd think, remember these there were, the committee was made of architects and developers and activists. And the activists, many of whom were also, practically speaking, they were architects or the planners or
Hmm.
at least very knowledgeable. So you'd think there would be people talking about, oh, did you see so and so's project? It's terrible or it's wonderful, and here's why, or here's in one way or the other. There wasn't that kind of conversation, and there wasn't that kind of conversation during the actual substantive meetings. We focused on how far away the notice signs should be. Should they be 4 feet by 8 feet, or should they be 5 feet by 7 feet, or whatever? And I thought, well, that stuff's important. Process is critically important. Disclosure and process are crucial. In, but I found it fascinating that there was very little discussion of, uh, that building would be great, except why do they have reflective glass? Like that. In fact, that's one of the buildings in my book. There's a little fast food place, which otherwise is not bad. It's
Uh-huh.
considering that it was built in the 80s. It's a freestanding building with parking surrounding it, but the building is actually attractive. They did make some real efforts in terms of the basic architecture, and it comes right up to the sidewalk and has lots of windows, but it's reflective glass. And so it sort of spoils to my point of view, it spoils it limits obviously it limits the interaction between inside and outside. But
Yeah.
those kinds of subject things weren't brought up in the conversations. And so I started looking around, and I don't know, I started as a hobby. I was taking pictures of things, and I just somehow I don't remember exactly. I got this bee in my bonnet that I should be explaining, that that's what makes an interesting city, all these accumulation of details. And
Yeah.
I think it's a part of a larger frustration on my part that most of us, I think, we don't see. We have very little kind of people don't see the physical environment. Most people, I'm talking about in
Hmm.
general, and we certainly don't seem to talk about it very much. It's gotten better, I have to say. It's certainly gotten a whole lot better over the last 30 years, and I've been sort of toying with the idea of doing a third edition, yet another revised edition. So I've started testing that to see, is there enough interesting stuff out there that I've never seen, or sort of variations on a theme, or maybe completely different directions. And I find a lot of it on Twitter, or with
Mm.
X, as formerly known as Twitter, or whatever it is.
Mhm.
I still call it Twitter, and I think we should
I
call it Twitter. You know,
Yeah, I don't
it's
think I'll ever stop calling it
no,
Twitter.
it's Twitter, and there's lots of interesting stuff. I mean, there's little detail. I say, oh yeah. So I've been keeping a catalog in my mind of not in my mind. I've actually started writing them down. Of oh yeah, that would be a good one to add, and that sort of stuff is to me, and I'm not sure why the book is considered, you know, of any significance, except to, you know, friends and family. But it's all these little details that can be understood and seen. And the interesting thing about the book, one of the things to me, is that there's no ideas in it per se. There's nothing like pie in the sky. They are actual
Yeah,
real things, at
yeah,
least almost entirely. It's examples of what actually exists. It's not David Sucher's idea of, you know, that we should have X, Y, and Z. So
yeah.
the other interesting thing I noticed about it very recently, I'll go take a look here. I've actually got the book right in front of me, my little working draft, and an awful lot of the things actually, which I have just discovered very recently, they actually also apply to suburbs and
Uh-huh.
awful, you know, strip malls and suburbs, which we almost all, you know, detest. So there's actually lots to be learned, or I think, in terms of how you might improve them. Um, Sort of things like the wayfinding, or even just creating little playgrounds for children in a strip mall, or
Right,
seating, outside seating. It could be, why not
right.
have outside seating in a strip mall? To either the either the, if the sidewalk's wide enough, that's great, or maybe you just take up a couple of parking spaces. So some of those ideas are actually applicable. But
Yeah, and
anyway,
you've probably noticed this as well as I have, but it seems like even in a lot of suburban areas, some of those little tricks and tips have been picked up
yeah,
on,
they
by
have.
developers in recent
Definitely,
years.
definitely.
Yeah,
I mean, the things people, it's hasn't changed enough, but there has been significant change over the last 30, 40, 50 years. I've been watching this stuff for 50 years now. My
yeah.
first job was as an urban planner, um, for the city of Seattle, working on shoreline management. That was in 1971, and things have changed.
Yeah.
It's quite remarkable. I mean, not
Well,
enough, but there's significant change of consciousness. I think people have really there have become. I still kind of moan and groan about it. People don't look enough and see enough, but it's certainly got a lot better, dramatically better.
yeah, I think
So
there's been a sea change in a lot of ways. So I wanted to ask you about that because even in the book,
sure.
you described yourself as a, urban planner and, a developer, and I
Hmm.
wonder if you could trace a little bit of your own career that led up not just to the book, but then even afterwards, what all did you do in the years after the book?
Well, it's mostly small scale developments in Seattle, little neighborhood scale buildings and condominiums. Nothing of any great consequence to anybody except that might have ever used them. But they weren't, you know, I probably, yeah, they're just basic stuff that's in tune with city comforts,
Yeah.
recognizing the, you know, the constraints, the real world constraints of the time in
How
terms
did
of required parking.
how did you go from planner to developer? What was that process like?
Oh boy, that's a well. I my first job was, as I say, was at the city as a planner working on. In fact, we were was a part of a team working on the very first shoreline master program. I think they were called master program. And part of my job was to review permit applications. So, you know, I was in my early to mid 20s, I guess, at that time. And guys not a whole lot older would come in with these rolls of plans, you know, for permits. And I started looking, I said, oh, that's what they do. And I started understanding the process of development. There was actual individuals. They'd come in and they'd buy some ground, and they'd hire an architect, and they'd get a set of plans, and they'd come and get a permit, and so forth and so on. So I found it just incredibly interesting and intriguing that that's actually how cities get created. They have actual individuals who go out there,
Mhm.
or groups, but a lot of it, small scale stuff, is individuals, or maybe if they inherit a property from their grandfather or something like that, or what have you. Um, and I just became interested in it, and I did the obvious thing that most people do. I mean, it's long gone, but I was able to buy an old. It wasn't even in that bad a shape. I bought a house on Queen Anne, which is right, an in-city neighborhood. Do you know Seattle
A little bit,
particularly?
yeah.
A little bit,
Mhm.
okay. An in-city neighborhood. And it was this, remember, this was probably 73, 74, I guess. And it was an estate sale, it's not surprisingly. And the house was, was $20,000. This is a
Huh,
house of 3,000 feet with a view of Puget Sound. Not a great view, but a
yeah.
decent view. You could still still see it somewhat. And I remember I thought that seemed like an incredible amount of money. And was I going? This going crazy? Was I taking a terrible risk? And so one of the older people in the department was one of the appraisers. We had a department of community development that had a bunch of different divisions. So he volunteered to go take a look at it and on the outside, and I can't remember exactly what the terms were, but he said, I can't remember exactly what, but he gave me some advice. He said, "Yeah, it looks like good property, and here's, that's not an unfair price, and yeah, you should go buy it." And I did, and so I remodeled it a little bit, just fixed it up, and just found it very exciting to do. And so I went on from to other projects. So
So
it's just very personal, is what I'm saying. It was started
yeah,
with my own desire to own a house, which
did
unfortunately is very difficult. The price
yeah,
of admission to the game is impossibly high now. And it's
yeah,
really, I mean, you can't just go buy an old lot for $5,000 and build a house anymore.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Did doing the development stuff end up then really becoming your career that
yes,
paid the bills and
yes,
everything? Yeah, okay.
yes, yeah, exactly.
And
Yeah,
and so did you eventually undertake, like, some new construction projects as
yeah,
well?
yeah, 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 a number of them. Yeah,
Mm,
exactly. So it was just the normal things that developers do. They try and find the right ground. Seattle's never had a tremendous depression in terms of real estate values. I mean, even in
mhm.
the toughest times over the last 50 years, when there might be suburban really slowdowns, yeah, things would slow down in Seattle. They would level off, or they would go down a little bit. But even for the last 50, 60 years, it's been an amazingly stable market and strong market, especially in
Yeah.
city. And now that's grown. The city has grown in terms of physical size. So yeah, it's been interesting.
So one of the things that I've had a number of guests on here before who were small scale developers,
Hmm.
and we talk a lot about getting into that world and things. Do you ever have the chance to talk to, like, younger people and advise them or whatever about how to do something related to what you did?
Yeah, I do. In fact, sometimes I've had a chance to talk to people who are interested in the built environment, the physical world. And I mean, depending on the person, I'll say, well, you really might consider going to business school, learning about, going with some kind of emphasis on real estate, learning about how that all operates, or but definitely engaging it rather than, even though I started as a planner, I like to see more people doing development, because
Yeah,
I think that's how we get good development, where people can both have I don't want to call it, I don't want to get kind of what's the word, oh, too idealistic. I mean, it's a business, and you have to make money at it,
Hmm.
But you can do it really well, or you can do it kind of without any care in the world. And I think that people can do both. It's possible to do both. And so
Yeah.
the more people who have, I think, a sensibility that you and I share, should go into real estate development. And
Yeah.
and the problem is, of course, that even just building a single family house is just, it's in Seattle, lots are, I don't know what, in city, 500,000, seven hundred
Mm.
thousand, a million. I haven't really kept track, but prices that are simply breathtaking, that
Yeah.
that builders are able to buy an individual lot for those prices and then make money on selling a house there. So
Yeah. So
and that's very difficult. It's very
yeah,
difficult.
and it's interesting to think about it. I know we'll get back to talk about the book, but I'm really curious about all this, especially
Sure.
related to your work and then the Seattle market. So, like for a younger person, let's say somebody who's 25 or 30 years old that is in Seattle and they'd love to do what you did, where would you have them look, or what would you have them think about starting to try to do?
Well, a good thing has actually happened, and this relates back to the one of the to an article that I wrote, and I think you mentioned it in one of your emails about one triplex per block.
Yeah. Hmm.
The city has not due to my article. It's been in the air for 10 years or more. Seattle changed its backyard cottage, its accessory unit law, pretty dramatically about 3 or 4 years ago. And I haven't agreed with an awful lot that the city council has done, but our city council really did a great job on this dadu accessory dwelling unit,
Yeah.
detached accessory dwelling unit for anybody that's not into the jargon. They've done a really pretty very progressive, very smart. And so I would say to somebody who was really interested, I would think that one path would be, and this is not easy either, is buy a house and then expand it, make it into
Mm.
basically a triplex. The Seattle law has effectively, and this is the city of Seattle. It's not necessarily all the surrounding jurisdictions, though they've those are changing too. I'm not sure how much, but they're changing as well. Seattle effectively now allows a triplex as of right on virtually every single family lot in the city. In fact, the city has formally changed it from single family zoning to, I think it's called, I thought, like light residential or
Hmm.
low residential, something like that, indicating that it's no longer, quote, single family, it's a smaller scale. And so that would be one path. If somebody had the ability to buy a house, you'd have to look at the potential for expansion. Is it enough? Is there enough ground there physically, and does the zoning allow it, and so forth? So first of all, it teaches you an awful lot about the whole transaction of buying a property, just in the course
Right.
of buying a single family house. I mean, I shudder to think that very, very few people in their 20s could ever do that. They're probably making so much money that they're probably not interested in going into real estate development.
Yeah.
Being realistic about it, somebody in their 20s probably cannot afford to do what I mean. I hadn't really thought about it before, but it really is sad. I think very few younger people could do what we were able to do at our age, or my age anyway, in
Yeah.
terms of get into having a house to live in, which is the primary goal. It shouldn't be a money making thing unless you're also interested in just learning about development, where you
Mhm.
kill two birds with one stone. You've got this terrific learning experience, plus you have a place that you can have fun with and enjoy living in. Um, so and so the that would be one path that would be practical for some people.
Right.
Um, where you look for it, you just sort of, that's part of the real estate. You figure out where's the uh, where can you afford, and what's happening with overall neighborhood change,
Yeah. Yeah.
so that there's demand for housing. But there's, boy, in Seattle, and I don't know, and it's not just Seattle. There's an awful lot of places in this country. We're, we're a very prosperous country. We're
Hmm.
really kind of, with all of our problems. which are substantial. There's a lot of prosperity and a lot of growth. Um, so that would
Yeah.
be one path.
Interesting. So, um, talking back about the book again for a minute. So, one thing I'm curious
Hmm.
about, I, you know, the book itself obviously is organized into these very short, little vignettes,
Right,
basically one or two or three pages about things.
right.
It certainly has the feel of like pattern language by
Oh,
Christopher
totally.
Alexander. Was that a big
Abs-
influence for you?
Absolutely, totally. I mean, there's no question. I can't remember exactly. I'm not sure if it was. I mean, I was aware of the book and I liked the book very much. I didn't agree with all of the details, of course, but it was inspiring. And I
Yeah,
think I think it just showed me that I don't have to write a long narrative. In fact, I
yeah.
can't. I'm not able to. It's just not one of my skills. I can write well, but for about 100 words or 200 words. More than that, a narrative of it's not me. It's not my ability.
It's actually
But
really well suited to the social media age. So that's
exactly. No, no. I find it in terms of reading these days, I can read, and I learned about this is a whole different insight. I can read novels. I can read, like Lee Child's Jack Reacher novels. I love
yeah,
those. I can't read, and I'm not proud of this. It's just a fact. I find it difficult to read a long nonfiction book. Most of the
yeah,
time, they're simply too long, and I
yeah,
think that does relate to the economics of publishing. A publisher really can't, and I know I learned this from my experience. At least that's my observation. I learned this from self-publishing about the economics of actually manufacturing a book, of printing it, and producing it, and it's the cost of of producing a book. Suppose a book really the author really has about 75 pages to say. Well, publisher just that's not economic because nobody really wants to buy a 75-page book for $20,
yeah,
but the publisher really has to sell it for something like that. So there's a sort of an encouragement, and this is my surmise. I don't really know that that's what happens in the publishing world, but this is my observation that in terms of if I wanted to simply do another short book now that was 75 pages, it would almost in this get into the same realm of cost if you really start externalizing all the or internalizing all the costs of an editor doing it. Like when my labor is free when I do that kind
mhm,
of stuff. But if you're a real publisher, you have a staff doing that, and handling one book of 75 pages is going to be the same internal overhead and general conditions in construction terms of a 200 page or a 300-page book. I mean, of course, there'd be more editing time, and
right,
there'd be obviously more manufacturing in terms of pages and ink and so forth. So I think that's one of the reasons, to my mind, a lot of books are uh, too long. Now,
yeah.
if you're a real specialist, you might want to have a 300-page book on something because you really want to look at it very carefully. But me, I'm a I can't do that anymore. It's
Well,
just
I mean, it's funny. I've got like this collection of books next to my bed that a whole bunch of nonfiction books, and I have a hell of a time now picking them up and wading through
I
them.
know.
But
I
like you,
understand.
I could sit down with a novel and I can read novel after
Right.
novel and it's
You,
fine. But
and
eh,
part of it's the skill,
yeah,
I'm looking forward to, and I'm sure, obviously, I'm not the only one, of the last volume for the LBJ
mhm,
biography saga.
yeah,
And that I probably will read through because
yeah,
it's just so incredibly well written and engrossing that it really does. I will read the whole thing, but
yeah.
that's
Well,
not very common.
his books are more like a novel
Yeah,
than a
he's
traditional nonfiction book.
he's brilliant. He's not your
Yeah,
typical. I'm afraid he's incredibly good at it at
yeah,
being a writer. Caro, I'm
yeah,
talking about Robert Caro,
yeah.
of course.
Right, right.
So yeah, it's tough. It's tough.
So when you wrote the book in the '90s, what sort of reaction did you get to it at the time, and or feedback or anything that came about as a result of writing that book?
Well, by and large, positive. I look back on it and I sort of regret a little bit that I didn't get much more critical criticism as opposed to simply praise. And I realized maybe if they had taken it more seriously, they might have attacked it more. You know, just
Hmm.
sort of found the flaws in it or
Hmm.
the problems but basically I mean I was very positive. I mean
Yeah.
it's been yeah, no, I would call it a modest success. It got good words from a lot of people.
What
I
was
still
there
get
any?
people. I'm sorry,
I
go
was going
ahead.
to say, was there any impact locally, like in the Seattle market, in terms of people reading it, talking to you about it,
No,
or
zero.
yeah, really?
Zero. No, I've been invited to speak as far away as Saudi Arabia, New Zealand. The book was translated into Japanese.
Huh.
Um, but locally, no, no, nothing. It's just it's taken for granted, I guess.
Yeah.
But it's
Well, you're never an expert in your own town,
yeah,
so I guess that
exactly.
holds for everybody.
Yeah, that's the truism, and it's true.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating. I picked the book up again this morning, and I was kind of paging through it, and I've got this kind of ridiculous, like dog-eared
Yeah,
copy that I've had
good.
forever. Um, And one of the things, that really stuck out to me is that even though it's almost 30 years old, there's so much of it that feels like could be written today. That, as you mentioned, I think there has been an absolute sea change in a lot of thinking and attitudes, and
Mm-hmm.
certainly a positivity towards city life.
Mm-hmm.
But there's many, many of the suggestions and details and everything that we still seem to get wrong over and over again in cities everywhere, and that it's almost like people could benefit from picking this up as if it was a brand new book.
Well, that's what I've received. Sort of maybe I'm just thinking about it or more aware of it, but I've received enough spontaneous um, praise that it has made me think about yes, the world hasn't changed enough. Um, the book would still be valuable. A third edition would still be useful to people, especially if it was because there's still millions and millions of people out there. Um, I think the what has changed, interestingly, is my emphasis on the three rules
Yeah,
about that has become not because of me, but I think that's just generally sort of so obvious, and it's I'm
yeah,
not the only one saying it, but that has become much more a an assumption about in urbanism. People are able to articulate that the reason this building is not so good is because I mean, obviously, Jane Jacobs was the first one to really talk
mhm,
about it, but blank walls. That there had to be. She was the one who emphasized the necessity for the the permeability
yep,
I'm not sure if that's the word she used, but that's my word. The permeability of the building from of the building in terms of the people inside it to the people outside of it, and vice versa.
yeah,
Um,
and
and
if I'm just going to interrupt you, I'm just going to highlight those three rules because I think it's important to refresh people's memory. But they're just really basic rules
yeah,
and patterns that you told them.
very
One
basic.
was yeah, one, build to the sidewalk. Number 2 is make the street front permeable. And number 3, put the parking behind or under or above or to the side of the building. And
Right,
so
right, right. And there's
that
of
if you
course three. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I didn't
I
mean
was
to.
gonna say, if you do those 3 things, you're 80% of the way towards making a really good place.
Exactly, and that's and there's three associated just for anybody that's listening. There's three associated sub rules, but I think one of the things Seattle has a design review process, and I was unfortunately I have to say part of the creation of that process, and I regret the way it's evolved because
Hmm,
apparently right now. Um, it can take a year, 18 months for a project, a 30, 40, 50 unit apartment building, which is not that big these days because the
right.
zoning has changed so much that it's the city is encouraging projects of 5, 6, 7 stories of quite a few with reduced parking requirements as well.
Right.
And I think an awful lot of design review, dramatic amount of design review, could be simplified by asking, does the building reflect the three rules?
Yeah.
And if it did, you'd say, oh, okay, that's 75 or 80% there. Fine. Then
Yeah.
we get into some other little refinements, like one of the sub rules would be, I can't remember here. Yeah, no, right. The sub rule on the building front being permeable says no reflective glass or other
Yeah.
things that would block. Now, there you get into another interesting subject of how do you manage things down the road? Because I notice a lot of the drugstores, CVS, or I guess I can't remember the which ones there. We had a local chain, Bartell's, which was just absorbed by a much larger company in the last year or so, and I can't even remember who it is. Maybe I still call it Bartell's. In any case, a lot of those stores will have big, and maybe supermarkets do it as well. They have big signs up in the front of the windows that the design made the city may have said, yes, you have to have 80% glass on your front,
Right.
and but then they'll put up signs. And the thing is, the building inspectors see that, and everybody, people go in, all kinds of city officials of all related to the building department see that, but there's no training of the staff to explain. Look, this is actually very significant. Blocking visibility is not. We don't want that, and so you
Yeah.
really need to. If you see that, you need to go that up to the chain of command and have them start the process of writing a letter to the building manager or the store owner or what have you, and say, look, that's breaking the rules. You're not supposed to do that, and here's the reasons why.
Yeah.
Because your store really does contribute to the overall local neighborhood economy, but you're hindering it by having these signs up. But we don't
Right.
have that internal consciousness yet. So there's still a long way to go internally in terms of simple things. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, but it's also true that I think if a lot of city governments would just, if they could dial it down to nothing else but those three basic
oh,
approaches,
right, right, right.
that they, there would still,
Absolutely. So there's no reason why Seattle has a year to 18 months design review. And I look at some of the buildings, I say, yeah, they're okay, but they took 18 months to do that? Wait a second. I mean, it just doesn't, I don't get it. And
yeah,
I have to admit, I haven't gone through the process of any of those buildings, so I don't really see the internal dynamics, but I know that the time frames apparently are so, and I see the buildings, and yeah, they're better than they were in the 1950s, but
right,
it's mostly because of things like the three rules. I don't want to say it's my doing, but at all, obviously, it's part of a sea change of consciousness in terms of
yeah,
urbanism. I mean,
yeah. I think there's been a broader change in everybody's awareness,
yeah,
including developers,
yeah.
about what works for different
You,
buildings.
you know what we'll really know, well, what we will really see when things are changed is if the Pritzker Prize is awarded to CNU
Yeah,
as the winner, when Plater Zyberk and Dwani and
yeah,
the others, they should receive an award. Now that's not going to happen for a while. That's a whole different consciousness in the
that's
architecture world.
yeah, it's
But
probably a
they
generational shift at some
but,
point. Yeah,
yeah, but they should be getting. I mean, they're far
absolutely.
more important than almost any of the other architects. I mean,
Yeah,
vastly more important. And a lot of that's come not just from the organization, but that general change of consciousness. And I think they have definitely been leaders of it, and
yeah,
deservedly should be rewarded. I guess is it. So
yeah.
yeah, no,
I,
no, it's a useful way of explaining urbanism to people.
I wanted to read one early section of the book back to you and have you react to it at the risk of
Oh yeah, I
embarrassing
could,
you, but
right, because
uh,
I might have. This stuff's from a long time ago. I might have changed my mind.
I know.
So
Well, I think this is really interesting, and it's just basically where you talk about comfort. That my you said my own experience with local government is as a staff member, citizen, and real estate developer, and I believe our society makes the problem of city building far too complicated. We confuse it with grandeur and we confuse it with complex public administration. It is neither. The main task is making people feel comfortable, the same task faced by the host at a party. In fact, think of the main job for the city planner as being the Vanderbilt of the city. All around us are examples of excellence in concept and design, city comforts. They are simple to recognize, simple to explain, and by and large, simple to build. Um, so, I mean, I think that's an incredibly eloquent way to talk, sort of like tee off the book. I wonder how you react to that and think about or expand upon that today.
It sounds good to me. I mean, I didn't. If you had if I hadn't if somebody else had read that, I'd say that's kind of vaguely familiar. I certainly agree with it, but I don't remember writing that. So,
Yeah,
but no, I think I'll stick with that. I think it's so. I mean, you can make a counter argument and say, well, look, they want lots of parking. That makes
yeah,
people comfortable too. I say, yeah, I know it's still a matter of to some degree of taste. If you want to live in a walkable neighborhood, you have to figure out how to handle the parking in a different way than having it right on the,
yeah,
at the edge of the sidewalk. It's
yeah,
the simplest, way of explaining the difference between suburbia and, uh, cities.
right. So, what over the years you've probably had the chance to look at things that you wrote or think about them? Are there aspects that have changed in terms of your thinking about city design and some of the details and otherwise?
Uh, Not really. I mean, I I live in a detached house, and I like the space. I'm a little less, and I'm not. Uh, so this may be not quite exactly the question that you're asking, but I'm a little less patient now with people um, diminishing the very widespread preference for a detached house, not because of it's
Uh,
detached per se, but because of the space and flexibility. And so I know a lot of people are very, they knock it and they claim that it's a manifestation of racism and so forth and so on. And I say, well, that some of those things may or may not be true. That's a separate issue. But there is something nice about having a lot of room. And
yeah,
so I guess if to the extent that I might have knocked single family, and I don't even remember doing that, but I might have sort of dissed uh, single family housing, I probably would have changed my view,
yeah,
because there's a certain genius. I mean, there's a certain genius to the American. It's not because it's American, but just it's because we had the space to do it. The
right.
single family, one a builder with a pickup truck and a laborer can build an awful lot of housing. And I
Mhm.
remember seeing one plat. I lived on Bainbridge Island at one time, and I remember there's smart developers. I think his son is still running the company. He bought a plat. I can't remember which one of our building cycles, but he bought a plat and with about 100 lots in it. And he slowly built it out, and it was successful, I'm pretty sure. And I remember a framer, he framed that whole house for him. And he had one this for this 100 uh, lot subdivision. He had one superintendent that came around and made sure the housing was done right. And he hired out, and there was one guy I remember who was a very good framer. He built it, he framed it himself. And I remember he was complaining about how he'd gotten back charged for throwing some pop cans onto the site. And the builder was very meticulous about a job site. And he back charged. He wanted to fine his own subcontractors if they
Uh,
if they violated it, which I thought was kind of neat. I didn't say anything, I don't think, but I thought, yeah, that's actually makes sense to me. But and I thought, so the American house building is very, I think the word is scalable. You can scale it up dramatically, and you can scale it down. If there's a building depression, you just stop building. You don't have
yeah,
to, that's why I am very skeptical, and I have written a little bit about this here and there about factory housing, and I have had some experience with it. I've been I've had some experience with modular housing, and they certainly have a role But when you look at having a large factory that's sitting there all the time, even when there's a housing depression, you have to factor that in. And so there's a real genius to the single family housing market, housing construction method. And I do
Yeah.
think we may want to change it, but there's something to acknowledge about it that it has
Yeah.
worked.
Well, and it's interesting because I think a lot of people who are not in the housing world or the construction world, they don't understand just how incredibly easy and quick and efficient it is to build a stick frame building.
Exactly. Exactly.
Uh,
I mean, it's remarkable. It really
yeah,
is. A good team. Now, it has changed. It's gotten far more complex. The regulations have gotten more
yeah,
complex. And builders, you need for anything, I don't know if they do it with single family, but building envelope consultants come in to make sure that it's doesn't have problems because we've changed the requirements in terms of interior ventilation and weatherproofing and sealing them and so forth. So
yeah,
it is different than it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But
yeah.
no, it's a remarkably simple system in many
Yeah.
respects.
Well, and I think I think I also understand what you're getting at from the sense. I guess it ties back to the book a little bit, but I think I first came when I came across your book, I was fresh out of college, and filled with all of the big grand ideas that you get in college. And I
Hmm.
went to architecture school, and I think there was, within architecture especially, there's a general tendency towards like utopian thinking, which probably surprises people who
Right,
haven't been to
right, right.
architecture school. But there's a lot
No,
of kind of
no,
grand utopian ideas,
yeah.
and then I come across your book, and it's just so eminently like practical and things that people can pick up and do, and you can understand right away. And I think that's probably one thing that really grabbed me and was attracted. But there's always this kind of tension between like the practical and the utopian within our world.
Yeah, I'm very, I started off in the I graduated from college in '67. If you can just visualize if you think about that time. And so I was very much driven by utopian thinking. Uh, I guess and I mean, Tyre. I don't know if you know. Do you know Tyre de Chardin, the
I
Jesuit anthropologist, written a book. Is very utopian in some ways. Some people would say it's not, but I understand utopian thinking very much. And I guess it changed when I started seeing how buildings were built, how projects actually came together. I realized and when I started doing it, trying to do it myself, and I realized how complicated it is. Even the simplest thing is
yeah,
complicated. It's
yeah.
it's certainly it's a lesson, but um,
And it's not to say that like having ideals is a bad thing. I mean, I'm still idealistic in many ways and have big dreams, but I just think it's good to have it measured by an understanding of how things actually get done, and where people where an individual can actually do something,
hmm
because it's easy to get lost in the big ideas. And I think your discussion about the single family house is relevant to that, because you're right, in the planning world right now there's a lot of demonization of single family detached housing, which is by far the default housing in our country. uh, and so I always kind of look at it like, yeah, those some of those critiques I agree with. Some of them are right, but it's like the default pattern that we have in almost every city in the country, and we have what we have, and how do we work with it? How do we improve it?
how do
Because
we
it's
get?
not, yeah, yeah. I mean, the idea it's going to all be swept away and radically changed is, it's frankly, it's just not going to happen.
Well, one of the things that's interesting, and it does lead to an initiative, is I hear people say, and I don't know if they're even serious about it. We should get rid of zoning completely. Let
Yeah,
anything be built anywhere, you know. And I thought, well, okay, but do you really think that there's a construction supply chain? Do you think there's enough labor to actually build those buildings? So what if you could build a 5-story or 6-story apartment building anywhere?
yeah,
And you somehow think we're gonna solve the whatever housing problems we have. because, and I'd say, no, there's just simply not enough labor. Now, that leads us to another thing in education. We should be stressing vocational training a lot more. We should be having
Yeah.
it more voc tech schools, and we should be encouraging people to to do it. I mean, I look back and think, what would what would have been my ideal education? I said, well, you know, maybe I should have been a plumber or an electrician or taught, you know, a specialist or in some other in some other actual trade, and that I relate to the trades. It could be other things too, and that doesn't mean that somebody is uh, sort of it's not a class thing where that means they can't ever get rich basically in our culture, because if you
Right.
look around, I don't think there are very many. I don't know if this is true or not, but I've often wondered, plumbing companies can do very, very well. And I think,
Absolutely.
I wonder how many plumbing companies are were built or managed by MBAs from Harvard. I doubt it. I think they were probably all, there were people from the trades, and they were smart,
Yeah.
and they recognized an opportunity, and they realized, now I know the plumbing trade, but I'd like to make some more money. Being a plumber is
Yeah.
okay, but I'd rather, make a lot more money than that. So I'm going to just build a plumbing business. And I think, and I'm not trying to diminish the ease, I'm not trying to say it's simple to do that, but there's a lot of potential for individual growth in the trades, in
Yeah.
terms of, they don't come, and they're pretty good sized companies. They may not be, may not be plumbing companies. There may be no IBMs, or I guess that's an old way of describing big. IBM. That dates
Yeah.
me all
I know.
right.
I get where you're going.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, I know. Probably a lot of people would understand that too, but it's
yeah,
still funny when I said that I realized, no, you don't use IBM as a measure of
of
huge.
size. Yeah.
That's kind of
Yeah.
funny. But
Well,
so,
it's interesting. It makes me think. I had a developer friend of mine who used to tell me that a local guy here that the happiest people he knew were the master electricians that worked on his jobs, and they worked 40 hours a week. They all made really good
mm-hmm,
money.
mm-hmm,
They had a house at the lake. They had a house here.
yep,
They had a house at the
yep.
lake and a boat. And they felt, he's like, they have a great life. They're all really happy and enjoying what they're doing. And I think there's a lot to be said for, what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think electricians especially, because that does require a pretty, because of the life safety issues. It does require some real um, training. I mean, you just
Yeah.
can't, you've got to do it right, or else people
Right.
die. And
Right.
so they probably have more training on average, maybe not as plumbers, maybe similarly with plumbers, where there's also life safety issues.
Right.
It's not an on the job thing as much.
Right.
So, but anyway, that's just an aside.
I do want to hit on the triplex on the corner issue, just because for people
Sure.
who may not be as familiar with the discussion that was had in Seattle. And I say that because I think, again, this was another. I read your article when it came out. I thought it was fantastic. I thought it was a great way of taking something that was complex that people were talking about and dissecting it into a very specific, practical application. I wonder if you could talk about like where that came out of the housing policy discussions in Seattle.
Well, I guess I would just reread it myself, and it's totally accurate. What it says in the article is, I was listening to one of the local elected officials, city councilwoman, who said, "Well, we have a housing problem, but it's not going to be solved, or really even it's not going to be a particularly significant factor if we built a triplex on every block." And I was pleased with myself. I had to say, that I actually listened to people. And so she said that, and I said, I mean, I listen very intensely to people when people make factual statements or numbers, anything that involves numbers.
Yeah.
I always think, oh, what are the actual? Let's do the math. So I thought, okay, triplex, and she's saying that building one triplex in every block wouldn't be significant. I said, okay, maybe, maybe not. So I had an acquaintance who at the city who was able to use their uh, GIS system. And I didn't know how he did it, but he was able to figure out how many blocks there are and how many block faces or whatever number we used. And I just did the simple math. I said, there's a certain number of block faces. If you put one triplex on every block, depending on whatever definition you want to use, that amounts to a significant amount of housing. So
Yeah.
let's at least, why don't we take that seriously? And then, of course, people, they say, well, how would you decide, which one? And I say, well, it could be the very first one on the block. And they say, well, that wouldn't be fair. And I say, wait a second, if nobody wants to build and it will okay, then build another one on the block. I mean, it's sort
Yeah.
of like it's kind of funny to attack it because it would be too successful. Too many people would want to
Yeah.
build one triplex on every block. So how are we going to allocate them? Which may be true in some neighborhoods, and that's fine.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
wouldn't bother me. So what was
Yeah.
what other what else struck you about it as just because
Well,
it's so simple
it's
as
the
a
fact that it was such a simple way, and instead of like a broad sweeping change to like every lot from a zoning standpoint, that you could just target and say, uh, we could say the corner lots of every block could be a
right,
triplex,
exactly. That
which
was
by yeah, which is easy to build because it turns a
right,
corner, so it's
right,
easier to get
right,
3
right,
units,
right.
and then you're not necessarily changing everybody's zoning everywhere to have to get it done.
That's exactly when I did have some fruitful discussions with people. Somebody suggested, well, a neat way to do it. It might have been an architect, in fact, said, yeah, we should just say on corner lots that we should
Yeah,
allow some number on corner lots, maybe every corner, but whatever.
yeah,
Designate only corner lots where you could do that as a test. And I said, yeah, that sounds fine. That's not
yeah,
bad.
yeah,
So that's interesting. You mentioned that you say corners. It's
yeah.
exactly what somebody else said.
Yeah, I think
Good.
we've had some discussions here in the past about just even thinking about like duplexes on corner lots in single
Yeah.
family neighborhoods, and
Hmm.
so I think in a higher demand housing market where you can do the triplex or even a fourplex, it makes a lot of sense. Um, I wonder if you want to talk about the gondola real quick.
Oh, absolutely. Definitely. I find it absolutely fascinating from many respects. I don't know how many of your listeners will even have ever heard of the Little Cottonwood Canyon or the Big Cottonwood Canyon, but there are two canyons that are very close to Salt Lake City, within bus distance, literally. I mean, there used to be a city bus going up
Hmm.
to them. Each of those canyons has two very, very good ski areas. And there's been uh, a proposal from the ski areas to build a gondola from the base of the Little Cottonwood Canyon to the ski areas, which is about 8.5 miles. And the it's been subject to intense discussion in Salt Lake over the last 5 or 6 years. And the Utah Department of Transportation, I guess it became such an issue and it was taken seriously that the Utah Department of Transportation did a study on it and finally came up with a final EIS and a decision. And if it's a federal, I checked into this. It's under NEPA. It's under the National Environmental Policy Act because there's so many state national forests that are
Okay,
in the path of the gondola. So somehow it's involved with federal law. Well, not somehow. It's involved with federal law and permissions. And the Department of Transportation, UDOT, made a decision in July, which I consider to have been inspired. And I think that everybody should be very happy about it. The advocates of the, is there a specific question? Was there anything that
no, go
I
ahead.
should
You're
fill in?
fine.
Okay. I think the advocates, or rather the opponents rather of the gondola, have done a terrific job of stopping it essentially, as I see it. And I guess I should also praise the advocates from the beginning. They were able to get this thing going 5 or 6 years ago. So they're at this point I see as the big losers. But the state legislature, the what's really interesting about it is the headlines in the papers locally in Salt Lake, the media all say something like, Department of Transportation decides in favor of the gondola. And so you read that and you say, "Oh no, what a terrible thing! Oh, that's horrible." I'm opposed to the gondola. I think it's a bad idea. I think it's just a lot of reasons why, but so it's not a good idea. And but people, the headlines are presented as that. When you read the article and you read the record of decision, it says. Um, to do this, we're going to do it in 3 phases. Phase one is going to be an enhanced bus system, which is the core of it. Even something as simple, and it's getting back to city comforts and the details. One of the problems with the traffic, I probably didn't really explain this very well. The reason there's a gondola proposal at all is because the traffic can get very bad going up to the ski
Mhm.
areas because it's a narrow canyon and it's steep and it's a lot of snow, and so there's problems with traffic snarls. And one of the things in phase one that the state is calling for is an enhanced enforcement of its existing laws requiring drivers to have at least snow tires. I thought, wait a second, that's pretty simple. So you don't have a cop, or you have a skier employee at the base of the canyon with a big sign saying, "You'll be ticketed if you get caught, not using snow tires." And apparently, no, it hasn't been done because I've never seen maybe there's a sign that says, no, you have to have snow tires or some kind of other traction device. But it's apparently that is one of I'm told by anecdotally that's actually one of the reasons there's traffic jams is because some will drive up in a car with, summer tires and they'll get stuck,
Right.
whether they're simply risking it or naive or whatever. But the core of the decision is that it's going to give 100 the state legislature, and I think they should be complimented too, um, as they're giving $150 million as part of this phase one. Now, the phase three is actually building the gondola, and even the highway department, not the highway department, Department of Transportation, is
Mhm.
saying that's not going to happen until the 2040s. So I'm
Yeah.
thinking, wait a second, you're saying that the gondola is going to be the winner, but you're not going to build it into the 2040s. How is that a win for the people who are advocating a gondola? The bus system, which is and the state's not giving any money, at least anything significant that's noticeable in terms of moving the gondola forward. But they're putting up $150 million for phase one, which is the core of which is buses, and yet there's a feeling among a lot of people, among the gondola opponents in the Salt Lake area, that it's some sort of like maybe not disaster, but close to disaster.
Yeah.
And there's even talk I've heard about appealing the
Huh.
final EIS, which to me would be kind of like, if I was a gondola advocate, I'd say, throw me in the briar patch.
Yeah.
It's just like, what better way to put things back than by appealing it, and then at that point, the forces at Utah DOT would be very kind of maybe required even, but they certainly might be logically inclined to say, well, look, since this is in such doubt right now, we won't do anything. We'll put that $150 million for buses aside and wait till see what the courts say. Well, now
Uh,
that to me is
yeah.
crazy. To me, the analogy I draw was I was involved very in a very minor way with Seattle's refusal to take part in some nuclear power plants in the 1970s, and that was also very contentious back then. And the city council very wisely decided not to take part by investing in these nuclear power plants, nuclear power plants 4 and 5 in a sequence of them, in favor of essentially of conservation, the soft approach. The hard approach of the big capital intensive, kind of all or nothing um, uh, gondola or nuclear power plant versus the scalable, incremental conservation, and in this case, in the analogy would be in Utah, of buses and enforcement and other measures. And
Right.
I'm very inspired by what they've done. Now, obviously, let me say, I'm not a Utah local, so I'm obviously missing a lot of the kind of nuance and details about Utah politics. And so maybe if I really got tutored in it, I might change my mind and realize, no, it is not a very good thing. Even though it looks great, it's not actually good. But
Yeah.
from the outsider, I think it looks inspired.
Yeah.
The powers that be are granting money for the incremental, which ties in with city comforts. City comforts is all about incrementalism.
Yeah.
Um, they're opting for an incremental approach to solve this transportation problem that can with buses and other means, but I see buses as the core. And so it's fascinating, and that's where I believe that the locals should be focusing on and making
Yeah.
sure that phase one works, so that phase three, the actual gondola, by 2038, people are saying, gondola, why should we have a gondola? We have this excellent bus system. Why do we need to bother with something like that?
Yeah.
So
It's fascinating because that's in that world of departments of transportation, you almost never get that kind of incremental approach.
exactly,
It's
exactly.
always like the holy grail project or
Exactly.
nothing.
I
Yeah.
think it's important enough, should get some kind of, if I was a longer form writer and if I had that ability, somebody should really explain what happened there. And because it's a very, very interesting subject, and exactly all the subtleties. Hey, I may be all wrong. Maybe I'm missing. Maybe I've got a false view, or the Pollyannish view of what's happened. But I think it's great, and I think the opponents should be praised for, because obviously, without the opponents, I doubt very much if UDOT and the legislature would be doing the plan that what they're doing
Right.
now. It's part of their pushback on it that got us to where we are, or they are.
Yeah.
So no, it is. I think it's a real. It's progress. It's big
Yeah. And
progress.
I think it ties very well, like you said, to the theme that we had, sort of the utopian moonshot approach versus the gradual incremental
Exactly,
improvement approach.
exactly. It's
Yeah.
not a gondola. I mean, you don't know if it's going to work until you've spent $500 million or more
Yeah.
in building a gondola. You don't know if it's, and then because it also depends on people actually using it, and it just becomes you don't know until you've spent all that money. But you
Yeah.
can find out with buses. Is 10 more buses going to work or have much impact, or 20 buses, so forth?
Right.
Now, that raises a very interesting design question, and maybe our time may be up very shortly, but I think one of the fascinating things that I would be working on if I were a Utah local is I'd be hound dogging the Utah Department of Transportation to look into the optimum bus that will go up and
Mm.
down those canyons. It's a short haul bus. It doesn't have to be more than 8 or 10 or 12 miles from the parking lots or to the ski areas, but it has to have a lot of things. You have to be able to well, it's an interesting design problem. You want
Yeah.
people to get in and off a bus, into and out of a bus with clunky ski boots. So you want to make
Yeah.
it easy and safe for people. You want it to get up fast, so the bus doesn't have a long stop times. It doesn't take. It's not. You couldn't use a school bus. Very
Right.
awkward. You couldn't use a Greyhound. You need a very different kind of bus. Maybe that bus already exists, or maybe it could be easily developed. But that, to me, if I were involved with this, I would be focusing on the bus system, and specifically the bus design, because
Yeah.
that's going to be, because right now, a lot of times, I was up there skiing last year, and I was talking with some other non-locals, some other out-of-towners, and I mentioned the gondola because I was fascinated when I started learning about it. I said, "What'd you think about it as a bus system?" He said, "Oh, I hate buses. I'm not going to get on a bus. No, that's no fun." And I said, "Okay, well, that's how most people think of buses.
Right.
They think it's a suboptimum solution, and so the focus, I believe, should be, among other things, is making sure that bus system really works beautifully, splendidly." And that
Yeah.
means a very interesting industrial design question. I think that if I could wave a magic wand, I'd have there's probably an industrial design program at the University of Utah. Why doesn't some professors there get together and assign it as a student project? What's based on a chassis that's an off the shelf, you know, bus chassis. We don't want to
Yeah.
start with something that already exists that's easily obtainable. What's the ideal shuttle bus for our situation look like? You realize this is something interesting. They're actually already doing this. The Some of the buses, or maybe all of the buses that are used on those routes. There is a bus going up the Little Cottonwood Canyon, Big Cottonwood, and another canyon too, another ski area. They have Apparently there's a technology where the bus driver can engage chains while the vehicle is in motion.
Huh.
I had never even heard about that, but I was
Wow.
told about that by a bus driver. One of the
Huh.
bus drivers said, "Yeah, you can." I don't know exactly the details about how it works and all, but actually, you can engage the chains from the bus driver in the cab while he or she is driving it. And I think
Amazing.
that is amazing. I think it's very cool. And
Yeah.
that's sort of because I was thinking, well, gosh, they have to have chains on buses. They've got to stop. But no, they don't. They use them typically, apparently, oftentimes in school buses, because they have the same situation. They can't have the bus driver stop on the side of the road with kids and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway, that would be a very interesting design problem. What is an ideal ski shuttle bus for the Little Cottonwood Canyon
Yeah.
and
No
and
doubt.
Big Cottonwood? Actually, they've actually I believe that they've actually expanding. They recognize that if they make Little Cottonwood really great, then there'll be more pressure on cars on the Big Cottonwood
Yeah.
and Canyon. So anyway, it's
Well,
fascinating.
it is fascinating, and it's a great tie to all the other things that we talked about. Um, I We have done about an hour. We should probably wrap it up.
You bet.
David, I do like to ask my guests at the end of the show. I do call this the Messy City podcast, which is kind of an ode to neighborhoods and cities and places that are
Uh,
not so pristine and perfect in planning and development. And I'm curious if when I say that, if you have a place or a city or anything that comes to mind that is someplace you enjoy or you think about.
huh. That's a messy city.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the kind of places I like. I really enjoy. I find fascinating. I find, I like the light industrial parks.
Huh.
I find a lot of them. I know that's not exactly what you're talking about, but I find them to be fascinating because they're so vibrant in terms of entrepreneurial spirit. If you look around, not all of them, of course, but you find them filled with all sorts of odd little businesses
Yeah.
that are filled with. They're sort of the replacement for the cheap part of town.
Yeah.
And I guess that's kind of what I'm why they're so fascinating. I'm thinking of one in particular, the Cloverdale Business Park, which nobody even in Seattle would probably know about, but it's just a normal, ordinary, you know, uh, light industrial park, all automobile oriented. There's a small cafe in the front, which they always have. That's so people, it only runs, Monday through Friday for, lunch hours basically. But
Yeah.
those neighborhoods are filled with. I've been wondering, say, what's new urbanism say about light industrial? What would be, or
Yeah.
just, how do we handle those? I think, well, there's plenty of time to handle them because there's lots of other more immediate issues to deal with in terms of cities. But I find those neighborhoods really interesting, and
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting comment because there are places that we don't talk about very much, and there is so much that happens in those light industrial parks all over the place, and it really is pretty fascinating.
and there's not, because you don't have the old loft buildings which you might have
Right,
had. They're in the cities, in a lot of cities, that they've been gentrified
right.
for better or worse, mostly better. Um, So yeah, that would be, I'd say, in terms of. But I know what you when you described it as messy city. I think I knew what you meant. I said, oh, that I know exactly what it means. That's cute. That's appropriate. That's fine. I mean, it fits. Just a place where people really live.
Yeah.
So
Well, David, thanks so much. It's been
yeah,
a lot of fun to
yeah,
have you on
me
here. I
too.
really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, no, it's great. I appreciate it. Thank you. I'm flattered that you.
All right. You too. You too.